We're going to dive a little deeper into the idea that there's different ways to look at abnormality, and different ways that we do look at abnormality, depending on who the therapist is, what their background is, and what the treatments are. So let's hop into that, shall we? Um, the models matter because, like I was saying, they determine how the therapist or clinician is going to think about the disorder and the individual who has the disorder, and also then how to treat that individual with their abnormal behavior. Um, there are three basic models that I'm going to talk about. There's a couple of others presented here in the slides that are also in your textbook that I encourage you to take a look at. I'm going to spend one of these videos talking about the biological model, one on the psychoanalytic model, and then one on the cognitive behavioral. There are a couple other minor models that are worth taking a look at, humanist perspective, and then there's a couple of others that I encourage you to look at in the textbook. But these are the ones that I want to make sure that we talk about. So the biological model, as you can probably tell based on the name of it, is looking at biology, or looking at the body from a medical perspective, where we're looking to see where disordered and abnormal behavior comes from. We think that it comes from poor functioning in the body somewhere, whether that is in the brain itself or in some other part of the body. Generally speaking, when we're talking about psychological disorders, we're talking about disordered brain function, whether it is due to a difference in the structure of that brain or in the way that brain works in its chemistry. So, we pay a lot of attention to brain anatomy in the biological perspective, and a lot of our understanding of how the brain works has grown out of these strange occurrences like I mentioned last week with Henry Molaison and his epilepsy surgery that then removed his hippocampus, and we learned a lot about the hippocampus because he was missing one, and then we could test him. We learned a lot of our knowledge about the structures of the brain and what they're responsible for by some of these strange events. There's another one, a guy named Phineas Gage, who worked for a railroad company, I want to say, and was responsible for the explosives and made a mistake and ended up getting a rod through his head, and it destroyed a lot of his frontal lobe. And we know a lot about what the frontal lobe does and what it's responsible for based on the occurrence of Phineas Gage, right? So, at any rate, you can look at it. You can look at anatomy in a variety of at a variety of levels of abstraction or of resolution, I guess you could say. You can look at it at the single cell level, where you're looking at the connections between neurons. So you've got two different types of cells in your brain. Just a quick recap of sort of introductory psychology here. You've got your neurons, which actually do the communicating in your brain that send the electrical signals between which neurotransmitters pass. And then you have the support cells, the glial cells, that serve as a scaffold to keep all of the neurons in place and also connect to the blood supply in the brain and shuttle nutrients to the neurons. Your neurons are not directly connected to your blood supply. The glial cells form what we call the blood-brain barrier to filter out bacteria and toxins and all sorts of things, right? Okay, so you can look at brain structure and brain function on that level, on the cellular level, or you can sort of zoom out a little bit and look at the function of different structures in the brain. So when we use the word cerebrum, we are generally speaking about the top part of the brain. If you think about a brain in a jar, it's that top part that is wrinkled and you know the shape of it. You've seen these pictures before. Looking at the picture that we have here in front of us, it is the cerebral cortex and the corpus callosum, which is the connecting tissue between the two halves of the brain, and all of the midbrain structures. Essentially, the cerebrum is everything except the cerebellum and the brainstem, which are sort of the hindbrain parts of the brain that seem to be responsible for more basic functions, like maintaining blood pressure and heart rate and breathing and all of that stuff, and balance, all sorts of other things. Now, you do find, when you're looking at these brain structures, differences amongst those who suffer from a variety of different psychological disorders, not only in the connections between these structures, in terms of the neurons running between here and there, but also within the structures themselves, in terms of how much mass there is, how many neurons there are in that structure in the brain, and how much space it takes up, right? So we can look sort of at all of those different levels when we are trying to figure out what exactly is going on with somebody. I will not bore you with a lengthy discussion of sort of the basics of electrochemical communication in the brain. I would encourage you to give yourself a refresher course on that from your notes from Psych 1100 or Psych 1010 if you're needing it. But essentially, just the things that we're going to be concerned about in this class is the fact that you do have the electrical signal passing along the body of the neuron and down the axon. Once that electrical signal reaches the axon terminal, it releases neurotransmitters into the synapse, which is the connection between the axon terminal and the dendrite of an adjacent neuron, where they are actually communicating with each other. Those neurotransmitters drift across the synaptic gap, lock onto the receptor sites of the dendrite of the adjacent neuron, and then do their job. Whether that job of that particular neurotransmitter is to say, hey, pass this signal, or hey, don't pass this signal. That's the basic differentiation between your neurotransmitters. You have agonist neurotransmitters that do send a signal, antagonist neurotransmitters that tell the signal not to be sent, not to be further propagated, right? And you can get multiple axon terminals all meeting at the same dendrite, and these axon terminals may have different neurotransmitters in them. Each axon terminal, by the way, each neuron will only have one type of neurotransmitter in it because it's an on-off signal, right? It can only send one signal. But the dendrites can have receptor sites for a variety of different neurotransmitters, and so whether or not that signal gets propagated, that electrical signal gets propagated and gets sent on in this second neuron, depends on which neurotransmitter predominates. Is it the antagonist, which says, no, don't send the signal? Or is it the agonist neurotransmitter, which says, yes, send the signal? If you've got more of one than the other, then that's the one that will determine whether you send that electrical wave on down through the second neuron, or whether the signal stops there. Okay, we do pay a lot of attention in the biological perspective to the action of neurotransmitters, because one of the things that we've discovered is that the individuals who suffer from not necessarily every single disorder, but many of the disorders that we're going to talk about, have differing levels of neurotransmitters active in their brain. So folks with depressive disorders, for instance, tend to have lower levels of both, well, of a variety, whether that's serotonin, lower levels of serotonin in the brain, or lower levels of dopamine. Both of those are true. And if it's not necessarily that the neurotransmitter isn't working right, it's usually that a person doesn't have enough, is not producing enough of that neurotransmitter. And so the action that neurotransmitter is supposed to produce doesn't happen as effectively, right? And this is the chemical activity between your neurons. Now, interestingly, you've got a bunch of other chemical messengers in your body that share a lot of characteristics with your neurotransmitters, and in fact, in some cases, are even the same substances themselves. Serotonin, for instance, acts as a neurotransmitter in the brain, but acts as a hormone out in the body when it is out in the bloodstream. So there's quite a bit of crossover there. But you've got this whole other part of your internal messaging system that we don't think about or talk about nearly as much as we do about neurotransmitters. And that's the actions of the hormones as they travel through the body and uh, stimulate action in different organs of the body. Um, so we increasingly are trying to pay more attention to that. The action of cortisol, which is a hormone in the blood stream. High levels of cortisol can lead to neural to the destruction of neurons and to reduced um immune response and higher levels of inflammation. And so these are things that we want to pay attention to because that's going to change how people behave and may be a part of why they end up with abnormal or disordered behavior. Okay, now we also want to know, hey, there's a brain for you. We also want to know why these differences are occurring. Why do some folks have lower levels of serotonin or higher levels of cortisol? There's a few different reasons. One of the ones that we pay a lot of attention to is genetic inheritance. The blueprint for constructing your body is contained in your DNA, and it's ever so slightly different for every single human being. And depending on who your mom was and who your dad was, and what their health was when they conceived you, and how they behaved when you were young, um, I, that's more than just genetic inheritance, what I just said right there. But what you get from mom and dad in terms of the blueprint that then constructs your body and says how things are supposed to work can lead to differences in not only the action of neurotransmitters, but also in the structures themselves. It may be that you've got some rare allele somewhere in your DNA that causes your hypothalamus to either be bigger or smaller or more active or less active or whatever the case may be. And a lot of this can then lead to differences in behavior up to and including the development of psychological disorders. Now, usually it's not just the genetic blueprint itself, but the interaction of that genetic blueprint with your environment, what we call epigenetics, right? So genes and environment influence each other reciprocally, meaning that who you are, what your blueprint says you are in terms of your personality and your energy levels and all of your physical characteristics is going to direct you towards particular environments, and those environments are then going to impact how you develop and how you behave. And frequently, it is not just that somebody has something wrong in their DNA, but rather they have an allele that suggests a particular sensitivity or a predisposition towards the development of a particular disorder that then becomes activated or becomes stressed or exacerbated by the presence of environmental toxins or drugs in the system or interactions with others that then activate that particular set of behaviors that then causes the person problems, right? So speaking of schizophrenia, for instance, you have much higher rates of incidence of schizophrenia amongst drug users than amongst non-drug users. This suggests this particular sort of action where you've got a lot of folks out there who have genetic predispositions toward the development of schizophrenia. However, the development of the actual disorder itself is not a foregone conclusion, but rather depends on the interactions of that individual with their environment. And the stresses that the use of illicit drugs brings to the body and to the mind tend to make it more likely that then the person will develop the behavioral syndromes that are what we recognize as schizophrenia today. So that's the interaction between genes and environment that is that we try and pay more and more attention to as we get more complex and more understanding of these disorders. I think that's what I was just talking about. It's worth mentioning that there is a point of view within psychology, if you're talking about evolutionary psychology, that says that the genes that we have inherited exist because at one point they were adaptive, meaning they helped us survive and reproduce. However, it's worth recognizing that we live in a world and in a society, the human world that we live in is very different now than the society and world that most humans have lived in throughout the history of humanity. And so some of those alleles that maybe brought us something useful when we were, hunting down bison dressed in crude leathers and, sleeping in caves many hundreds of thousands of years ago, might be less advantageous and, in fact, might even cause some problems or lead to the development of disorders for somebody who is, sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours a day trying to fill out the TPS reports or whatever we're doing, right? So that is one reason some psychologists suggest that some of our disorders might occur. Okay. Now, biological perspective leads to biological treatments, right? If it is the body that has gone wrong, well, then let's fix what's going on with the body. The main treatments that we have from the biological perspective, and these are some of the most prevalent and most effective ones that we have, are drugs, yay, and brain stimulation is less common, but still used sometimes, and then psychosurgery. Gonna chop off the top of your head and root around in your brain with a stick. Hopefully not quite that, but you get the idea. We're doing surgery on the brain. Now, we talked a little bit about the history of the development of drugs last week. Really, the history of psychotropic or psychoactive drugs begins in the early part of the 1900s and becomes relevant in terms of actually helping people right around 1950 or so. So you've got four major groups of drugs that end up getting used today. You've got anti-anxiety drugs, which are your Xanax and wow, I'm blanking on any of the others. At any rate, these are drugs that are designed to reduce levels of anxiety in the individual, hence the name anti-anxiety. Antidepressant drugs, which you can probably guess, help increase mood and stabilize mood so that a person's not so sad and depressed. So that's going to be... Oh, nuts. I'm blanking on all my drug names right now. I'm sorry. Doesn't matter. You've got mood stabilizers, anti-bipolar drugs, which are unique in that bipolar we think of as a mood disorder, and it is a mood disorder, but it's something different in terms of what's going on in the brain than just straight up depressive disorders. And so there is a particular class of drugs, primarily based around lithium salts, that work for people with bipolar but don't have any effect on folks with depression. So super interesting. And then you've got your antipsychotics, which we talked about a little bit last time, the Thorazine and the other things that help folks distinguish between reality and hallucination a little bit more accurately. And that was the class of drugs that when it was developed, a lot of folks who were in inpatient scenarios suddenly moved to outpatient scenarios, and we had a bunch of mental health care facilities shut down throughout the latter part of the 1900s. Now, I don't care about that. Let's keep moving. Other treatments. Brain stimulation. Now, stimulating a brain. You're doing awesome, brain. That's not what we're talking about. Actually, what we're talking about mostly here is the application of energy in one form or another directly to the brain. There are a variety of ways you can do this. One of the earliest ones was what we call electroconvulsive therapy, where you actually apply electrodes to the head and pass electrical currents through the brain. This was first used as a treatment for schizophrenics during the early days, and when we were trying to treat that in the early parts of the 1900s. Super ineffective. Didn't actually help them at all, but they didn't know what else to do for these folks, and we hadn't developed Thorazine yet, so they shocked them, and it didn't help. Turns out, though, that there are useful therapies that can come out of ECT. Um, Cases of severe depressive behavior um, that are resistant to medication, meaning that somebody who has tried a bunch of different antidepressants and they're not getting any better, sometimes they will use mild ECT, where they sedate the person and then pass an electrical current through their brain for short periods of time. This stimulates convulsions, as you might imagine, but they're strapped down and given a muscle relaxant so that they don't hurt themselves. Interestingly, this appears to hit the reset button on your mood, where folks with severe depression report having long-lasting positive effects in terms of their ability to regulate their own mood after these sessions. There is the downside that it also tends to create amnesia. Not complete amnesia like you see in the movies where it's like, who am I? Who are you? But rather specific memories that a person can no longer access, that tend to be autobiographical memories. So the things that you know about yourself. Something like somewhere between a third and half of ECT patients report some memory loss due to their treatment. So it's not without its costs, but for someone who's suffering from severe depression, might be worth it, right? Now, transcranial magnetic stimulation. This one's fascinating to me. Given that our brain is electrical in nature, magnetic fields can affect the function of and the passage of that electricity, and we can actually disrupt that. Now, go look up TMS on YouTube, and you'll see some really interesting videos of folks messing with their own brains just by clapping a really strong magnet to the side of their heads. Don't do this at home, but there are therapies for which this is useful, where you can actually stimulate particular parts of the brain and direct the magnetic fields towards particular parts of the brain to increase the blood flow, increase the action of that particular part of the brain. And this is one that is sometimes used for folks with schizophrenia, where folks who have TMS applied to their temporal lobes tend to report having fewer hallucinations for many weeks after the treatments. And so that can actually be very effective in certain cases. Interestingly, it has the opposite effect. It actually, for one particular disorder, folks with obsessive compulsive disorder, TMS actually makes them worse. So it doesn't get used for that. You can have vagus nerve stimulation. Your vagus nerve is a major branch of your nerve that leaves your brain, one of the major nerves that leaves your brain and connects to your internal organs in your thorax. And you can, for particular therapies, connect an electrode to the vagus nerve and stimulate it to increase the action of those organs. Is useful in certain cases. And then psychosurgery, once again, that's going in and cutting out bits of the brain. We do this less than we used to. The more we know about the brain and the more effective medications and other therapies we have, the less anybody wants somebody rooting around in their skull. But there are still certain cases where we will go in and make precise lesions, meaning cut out a very small piece of brain, or cauterize or burn a very small bit of brain matter where it is causing excessive problems. This is sometimes useful in cases of severe epilepsy, which is an electrical overactivation of the brain. If you're getting too much activation, let's go in and sear that bit of brain or cut it out, and it's not going to cause you problems anymore. Now, as you can imagine, that frequently has other side effects. Generally speaking, we need our brain, so we try not to go cutting out bits of it. Nevertheless, that is psychosurgery is something that has been done historically with greater frequency than it is done now, but it does still exist and can be useful in certain scenarios. Okay, so as you're talking about the biological model overall, it is really probably the primary viewpoint for treatment when it comes to trying to help people get better. If you look at treatments for psychological disorders, the majority of folks, rather than engaging in some sort of talk therapy or approaching from some psychological perspective, are taking a medication. And that may be the only therapy that they are receiving is I'm taking my antidepressant and it helps me get through the day and I'm fine, right? That is sort of the ascendance of the biological perspective. If we can just fix what's going on in the body, the rest of it will take care of itself. And there appears to be a whole lot of truth to that. It may not be the whole truth, but it's true enough for enough folks that the biological model probably holds more sway in psychology than any other single perspective does. And the more we understand the body and the more we mess around with, chemical compounds that then people consume and, experiment with that, the better we get at bringing people relief from their symptoms so that they can live their lives. So that's super, super valuable. And it's tangible. It is, I mean, you can, for any system of the body, you can go and see exactly what's going on so long as you've got a good enough microscope. And it produces regular advances in our understanding of medicine and how the human body and brain gives rise to behavior. So a lot of the study that's going on in psychology right now is biological in nature. Now, what the biological perspective is bad at is the intangibles, right? It turns out that sometimes things matter that don't seem to have a basis in some difference in body structure or brain structure or anything like that. Sometimes people are troubled and can't manage their lives, and their bodies appear to be functioning just fine. So there are other things going on, and the biological perspective, if it can't find the problem, can't address the problem. And so it can't fix everything. Also, given that we don't know everything about the body just yet, sometimes we introduce interventions that cause more harm than good. And so, especially when you're talking about medications, every single psychoactive medication out there is going to have a list of side effects as long as your arm. And so you have to be really careful and balance the medications that you're taking in order to not cause more problems than you're solving, right? So, the biological perspective is not everything, but nevertheless, it is a big deal in psychology today, and definitely the first one that we needed to talk about.